And I think it has basically led to the emergence of a market in which, it has become very easy for anyone who is unhappy with a particular political group or social group to rent a cyber attack and then launch it. So in the case of South Korea and the American websites, I just think, anyone with a grudge against America could potentially be behind it, or anyone with a grudge against South Korea, or anyone who got bored during the Independence Day weekend. It's very hard to judge and to actually attribute those attacks to anyone. And I think this is where the main problem of actually going after the perpetrators lies. We simply don't know who's behind it, and we right now don't have any means of identifying those people. What do you think?
Well, I want to unpack a couple of different aspects of that. First of all, I thought it was fascinating that everyone sprang to the conclusion that the North Koreans were somehow behind this. I agree with you that we've gotten to the point where it's pretty easy to hire people to mount a denial of service attack. It's pretty easy to rent a botnet. Whether or not you can do it on eBay, there are certainly internet relay chat channels, IRC channels, where you can find people, and a number of reporters have gone out and sort of looked into renting botnets. It's very interesting that everyone has sort of concluded that it's North Korea. In some ways, that seems a little surprising because, of course, the domestic internet in North Korea is particularly underdeveloped. What everyone has been sort of speculating is that there's some sort of special cyber force that North Korea has been putting together. What's interesting about this is that special force would then be using the same tactics that a number of criminals, particularly criminals in Russia and Eastern Europe, have been using. The big thing that I want to put out there is that I think cyber war is just a terrible, terrible word for this. I think it's this enormous blurry term that tells us absolutely nothing, and that blurs together everything from breaking into missile defense systems or electricity grids and shutting them down through what's actually going on in this case, which is mostly, obstruction. It's as if people were saying, people are going on eBay and hiring mercenary armies to fight their wars, and in fact what they're doing is paying kids to spray. Effectively what these denial-of-service attacks do, mostly, is make it difficult to access a website for some period of time. They don't damage the data that's on the website. They don't, generally speaking, take down critical pieces of infrastructure. Yes, there was that case in Estonia where it became difficult to access e-banking services, but I'm not convinced that not being able to access the Department of State's informational website for a couple of hours necessarily constitutes an act of war. I actually this week have been trying to get a passport and have been trying to use the Department of State's website, and I think the website itself might constitute an act of war. So I guess I worry about media coverage of these events. Within the computer security community, we're very concerned about denial of service. It's becoming a real problem.
Sure.
It's worth talking about what those solutions are to denial of service. But is it helpful for us to give everyone scenarios of the old War Games film? What we're talking is very, very different from that.
No, I mean, I actually agree here on the overall exaggeration that a lot of media reports introduced to the subject area, but just to disagree with you slightly on the damage that could potentially be caused by DDoS attacks. I just like to reference the case in Georgia again, because what happened in Georgia is that the government's ability to effectively communicate with the rest of the world during a war was actually crippled down. So, the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was under severe denial of service attacks. Many other websites were down. So the government, at least that's what they've tried to argue, lost control of the messages, right? So they could not really communicate what they thought was going on in Georgia.
They couldn't call the New York Times? They couldn't call another country? I mean, I understand that a critical piece of internet capacity made it possible not to get messages out through that, but I find it difficult when people sort of say it's like blinding the enemy, it's like keeping your target from communicating. It's blocking one channel. Yes, it's an increasingly important channel, but it's not the same thing as saying that country was stopped from communicating.
But if you follow the debate in the United States about cybersecurity, I think what we are seeing, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, what at least I'm seeing is that there is this tendency to use examples like Georgia or Estonia or South Korea where something did happen and where something did look very menacing, but it was just denial of service attacks. So there is a tendency to use those examples to actually talk about the attacks on the U.S. government networks, which may not necessarily be denial of service. Those may be, pure hacking attacks, trying to get data, or trying to, in the most paranoid fear, I guess, in this country, to shut down the power grid. And I think we somehow, again, as you've said, because of using this catch-all term, cyber warfare, we kind of tend to mistake what's happening on the ground in places like Georgia or Estonia with more sinister attacks on data and on, infrastructure with denial of service, which is much more prevalent, again, as we've seen this week, but which is not as dangerous. Well, do you think the threat of attacks on data networks per se is greater than DDoS? Or
I think there are real threats out there as far as actually attacking data networks, going after records and such. But I think what's going on with denial of service is that this is a known vulnerability in the public internet. Because it is so common, because it's pretty easy to mount, it gets talked about a lot because it's far more common than serious hacking attacks that lead to data leakage, from what we understand. I mean, of course, the truth is corporations are actually pretty quiet about when there's serious data leakage through something like a hacker attack. But I would argue that this is far, far more prevalent.